Today's picks from Reuters breaking views. Why the ECB is wrong to urge an end to Greek haircuts. Spain's bank plan risks being more of the same. And how GDP-linked debt could make finance safer. With me is Peter Tal Larsen. Let's kick off with this ECB, well, the Orphanides comments. He says, drop the plans to force losses on Greece's private creditors. What's the alternative?
Well, this is a very good question.
I think that's the flaw, you think?
Well, yeah, I think that is the flaw. I mean, the ECB, we know the ECB has been opposed for a long time to the idea of haircutting Greek bondholders, and Mario Draghi has said that the plan is a mistake and so forth. But to actually say we're going to roll it back is a step forward. The alternative, obviously, is that then the public sector would have to bail out Greece in perpetuity, presumably.
What about this 30-year low-interest rate loan that Orphanides talks about?
Well, I mean, that's just a haircut by another name. And essentially, but essentially, I mean, be clear, what he's proposing is saying, if you don't bail in Greece has too much debt. Greece's debt is 160, 170% of GDP. If you don't bail in the private bondholders, then basically what you have to do is you have to pay them out in full, replace that with public money, and then haircut the public money. Now, you might not do so explicitly, you might push it out 30, 50, 100 years, cut the interest rate to 1%, but the point is, that is the only way in which you're going to get Greece's debt levels back down to some sort of acceptable.
And I guess the question is it worth doing this just to calm the markets, to reassure the markets? Because it would probably reassure the markets, this, wouldn't it?
It would reassure the markets. I mean, the Eurozone does have a problem, which is that they're saying, we want you to take a haircut on Greece, but there will be no more haircuts anywhere else. And that obviously is not a terribly credible position. But politically, it's inconceivable that the Eurozone bails out Greece in its entirety. I can't see that.
Do you think Orphanides checked with Draghi before he wrote this piece in the FT?
I don't know. I mean, I think they're obviously all allowed to kind of speak their own minds. But I think the feeling is that if he's stating this position, he won't be alone within the ECB in thinking that this is a good idea.
All right. Spain's so the new economy minister says no bad bank in Spain. But again, you don't really like the alternative.
Well, it's not that we don't like the alternative, it's just that they're sort of presenting, we haven't quite had the details yet, but they were talking about maybe doing a bad bank. That's clearly not happening. Now the economy minister is saying banks should set aside an extra 50 billion euros of provisions for bad debts. That's a good thing. Clearly the banks have a lot of bad debts on their books, and that's one of the reasons that the market is so suspicious of Spanish banks. But the problem is, just making extra provisions doesn't kind of magically create new capital for these banks. And he's even talking about spreading it over a couple of years, which would just kind of prolong the agony. So essentially, the problem is, this is the problem that the previous government had as well, is that Spain's banks have got a load of bad debts on their books that they need to deal with, one way or another. That requires new capital from outside the banking system to come in. It will probably have to come from the government, and trying to concoct some sort of plan that tries to deal with the problem without putting new money in from the government is probably not going to work.
Okay. Very quickly, this GDP-linked debt story. Edward Haddis thinks, and we've talked about this before, and it's something Robert Shiller has talked a lot about, I know that. But Edward Haddis thinks GDP-linked bonds, not necessarily the answer, but better than the other options right now. Inflation-linked, your standard bonds.
Well, I mean, yeah, GDP-linked bonds are kind of, they do take account of things like inflation, because if you link to nominal GDP, then the GDP expands in line with inflation and so forth. I mean, what he's saying is that part of the problem with the system that we have at the moment, particularly with sovereign debt, is that the debt is very rigid. The debt is not adjusted for ups and downs in GDP, ups and downs in inflation. And if you were to make the value of the debt, or the coupons on the debt, more explicitly dependent on the performance of the underlying economy, then the debt would be more flexible, and you would have less of these kind of rigidities that lead you with these difficult debt situations, and it then can only be solved by some form of default.
Okay, Peter, many thanks. You can find all of those stories, of course, on the Breaking Views site, also on Reuters.com. If you want to watch our US show, 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 GMT every day, I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters.